Hello, everybody. Welcome on in from wherever you are in the world today. We're going to give everybody a second just to pile in. See some people coming in still. See the numbers climbing a little bit. Hello, everybody. If you haven't seen me or met me before, my name is Nick Mitchell. I am your tech guy from Book Passage today, your host today. Alrighty. Hello, everybody. Welcome on into Book Passage Live. We here at the bookstore are very excited to bring to you some of the best authors and conversations you can find out there on the internet today. If you've seen one of our events before, then, well, welcome back. But if you're new here, Book Passage is an independently run bookstore in the San Francisco Bay Area. And back when crowds weren't quite so dangerous, we hosted book talks just like this one at our stores in person. As we are now streaming on YouTube, and I think we'll continue to do so in the future, please consider subscribing by clicking the subscribe button just below the video. Also, if you click the little bell next to the subscribe button and select all from the drop-down menu, you'll be alerted every time we go live or even post a pre-recorded author event, as we are likely to do every once in a while. If you want to check out tonight's book or anything else mentioned here tonight, you can find it all at bookpassage.com or in the link that I will put into the chat as soon as we are done with our introductions here today. Finally, if you have any questions for tonight's speaker, please take the time to write them in the YouTube chat, just to the right of the video or just below the video, depending on what version you're watching this in. I'll do my best to make sure that anything that you write there makes its way to our author, and although we don't always get to them, all of the questions and comments are very, very much appreciated. Now, let me introduce tonight's guest. Johanna Silver, author of tonight's book called Growing Weed in the Garden, a no-fuss seed to stash guide to outdoor cannabis cultivation. She was slated to publish this book right before the world shut down. Oops. She had previously worked as the garden editor for Sunset Magazine, where she earned a James Beard Award for her writing. She now freelances for Martha Stewart Living, Magnolia Journal, Better Homes and Gardens, and Eating Well. She's coming to us today from her home in Berkeley, where she grows fruits, vegetables, many, many flowers, and yes, as you might imagine, cannabis. That's enough of me. Thank you one last time for coming out, everybody. Please join me in welcoming Johanna Silver.
Thank you so much, Nick. We were chit-chatting before, and I have to say, I really like your presenter voice.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're great at it. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and then I'm going, oh, there we are. And then I'm going to hide myself so that I don't have to look at myself while I talk to you. And instead, I just look at a blank screen and trust you all are there. Hello, I'm Johanna. Thank you for coming today to hear me talk about my book. This is it, Growing Weed in the Garden, No Fuss Seed to Stash, Guide to Outdoor Cannabis Cultivation, that indeed published on March 24th of last year. And though people were very excited when cannabis was declared an essential business in those early days, people were not as much focused on what books were coming out. So I'm very grateful to be here a year later, a year and change later, here we are. So I wanted to just tell you a little bit about where I come from and my background and my perspective before talking about how to grow weed. So I am not from the cannabis world. I was a garden editor for 10 years at Sunset Magazine, started in the test garden, running a small editorial test garden. There was a trail of dirt wherever I went. And I culminated being the head of the garden department at Sunset, though a friend told me once not to call yourself the head of a department when it is a department of one, which is just to show the state of publishing by the time I was in charge. But I nonetheless was in charge of the garden department, and I wrote and learned about all sorts of plants. Not weed. Weed was not one of them. So I went to Alaska to cover a boom in peony farming that's happening up there. And this is south of San Diego in an area called Fallbrook, where a lot of protea farmers are, with these really drought tolerant, incredible blooms. And then at the tail end of 2017, I lost my job when Sunset was bought by private equity and didn't know what was next. So I was very clear that I wanted to keep writing, and I contacted every former editor I had ever written for, barking up their tree to keep writing. And one of my former editors, Kitty Morgan, had landed as a managing editor at the San Francisco Chronicle. And I asked her, will you assign to me? Just figuring it would be anything in my wheelhouse. And it was right on the cusp of 2018 when recreational cultivation and use for cannabis was going into effect. And she said, I want you to grow weed in your garden and document it as a gardener. And I told her, I don't even know where to get seeds. And she said, that's your opening line. So, the only legal way to get seeds in California, where I'm located and where maybe some of you are, is from a dispensary. It's the only legal place to get seeds or clones. You can get them, wink, wink, online as souvenirs, but for reasons we'll discuss later, it's not always super reliable. So anyway, I did that. I grew weed in my garden and I documented it for the San Francisco Chronicle as a gardener, and quickly fell in love with the plant. From a garden angle, it is super interesting. It is dioecious, which means there are separate male and female plants. And that's pretty rare in the plant world and in the edible world, in the edible gardening world. Kiwis, you need a male and female to fruit. Spinach is male and female, but nobody cares because if your spinach is flowering, it's bolting and it's found its way to the compost pile. So that was really interesting to me, on top of the fact that a finished crop is essentially unpollinated female flowers, unless you want to be having a crop full of seeds, which did the trick for me entirely all through high school. But these days is considered very passé to have seeds in your wheat. So you not only need to learn the difference between males and females, but you need to cull the males. So in my writing and research and meeting people and growing, I had a really hard time finding information for someone like me, a gardener who wants to grow it for the love of gardening. Everything out there read like an electrician's manual. Any nod to growing outdoors was more about what the scariest breed of dog was, how high your fence should be, and how to line your tracks with how to line your shoes with duct tape to hide your tracks. And no shame, it was a much different scene to grow outside back then, but that is not where we're at. These are just 3 books that are out. Ed Rosenthal on the left is considered like the Bible, but it is like almost entirely indoor. Feminist Weed Farmer is outdoors, but there's no pictures, and it is still geared towards growing professionally, and ditto with Grow Your Own. So there was just such a lack of information of where to start, of how it grows, of not growing to sell. I'm not changing my life's course. I'm not trying to sell to a dispensary. I'm not trying to maximize anything. I'm not trying to use chemicals. I'm just trying to grow this plant in my garden. And even on these seed packets that you can get in a dispensary, there's next to no information about how the plant actually grows. It won't tell you how tall and wide it gets. It won't tell you really anything. And so I decided to write that book that really walks you through how to grow weed. And in the book, there is a short introduction about the plant, a history of the plant. And another thing that really fascinates me about it is that it's one of the oldest cultivated crops for humans. And some people actually think it is the crop that settled us, that domesticated us. So when we first started breeding, when we first started selecting for this or that, this was about 10,000 years ago after the last ice age. And it was plants that were super useful that we started to select. Things like barley and peas and flax, things that you could use multiple parts of the plants for different purposes. And cannabis was right up there. The seeds have oil, can be used for fuel or food. The stalks can be selected for long fibers and be, textiles. And then, of course, the flower can be whatever you want to call it, medicinal, an inebriant. Either one has been with humankind since the beginning of time. So it is a really old plant that we have been selecting for a long, long time. And people will ask, does weed grow where I live? And the answer is yes. Wherever you live, weed grows outside there. We brought this plant everywhere where humans live. So the plant over time evolved and based on both the climate and what people were selecting for. So in equatorial regions where it's basically almost a forever growing season, the plants grew like the ones on the left, taller, reaching for the sun, taking a very, very, very long time to finish. And historically that was called sativa. If you've heard the term sativa, it used to be to describe a sort of type of plant. And then alternatively, indica was the plant, how it evolved in regions that were at much higher elevation, cold, where winter was coming, and selected for different things as well. And those plants are shorter and squatter and more resinous. And that was called indica. Now, whatever you get your hands on to grow, I can assure you is a hybrid. So there's been so much crossbreeding and such little record keeping that sativa and indica, not a good indication, not a good litmus test for choosing what you grow. You're going to be getting a hybrid. And now people use those terms also to describe the type of high. Sativa thought of as cerebral, daytime, and indica, I just learned recently, indicouch is sometimes what it's called, and really sedating. These are entirely subjective. And anytime you are at a dispensary and you're buying things with percentages, let's say this percent indica, this percent sativa, that's entirely fabricated. And your best bet is to talk to the bud tender, who may or may not, to be honest, be trained, and to ask for the desired impact that you're looking for, the desired effect, rather than in terms of sativa indica. And to know that so much of this is subjective. For me, I am really a one note wonder with weed. No matter what it is labeled for, sleep or play, I am cleaning a room in my house. So the only way to figure it out is sort of to try for yourself. So in my book, as I proceeded with writing it, I found that I had much more of a point of view than I necessarily anticipated at the start. And one of the reasons is I am a gardener. I've been doing this for a long time. And I speak garden, I speak gardening, and the cannabis world, bless its heart, has been under prohibition for the last 100-ish years. And that has made things kind of weird. For example, calling everything a strain instead of a cultivar. There is no other plant we talk about in terms of strains. I'm not going to tell you which strain of tomato I'm growing. So the word is cultivar, or as we all sort of colloquially misuse, variety. You can get by with variety, but there are just a lot of practices from lingo to cultivation practices that are kind of screwy. So I use cannabis, weed, pot pretty interchangeably. I stay away from marijuana because the term came out of the 1920s when prohibition was really getting up and going, and it was a term used to demonize weed coming in from the southern border, and demonize the laborers coming in from the southern border, who were stealing jobs, etc. Might sound familiar to now, and so I don't really use the word marijuana, and I'd probably encourage you to start backing away from that one. And the book talks about plant anatomy. It is indeed, it's a summer annual. Okay, it's a one and done. It completes its life cycle. No matter where you live, it completes its life cycle in one growing season. So the season is just, the plant is either adapted to a longer or shorter one, and it's adapted to grow longer stalks or not, or to have a really resinous flower. And another reason I love growing weed, is that I feel like a badass every time I grow it. The book is actually dedicated to, I can show you the picture. It's dedicated, I hope you can see that, I have my self view off, but it's dedicated to high school me. because she was pretty into weed, but I'm not as much anymore. I am a mom, I have a young kid, I'm boring, I'm tired, I'm going gray. But every time I see that cannabis leaf in my garden, I feel like a badass. And that in and of itself is one of the reasons I keep growing. And so, yeah, so now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, did I miss something? Okay, yeah, I wanted to actually tell you a little bit more about some of the things in lingo that we cleared up. So we talked about sativa indica kind of being very misleading, both in terms of the plants you get your hands on are going to be hybrids, and also as sort of outdated descriptions of highs. We talked about cultivar strain. I wanted to also go through a few more things that are sort of jumbled in the cannabis world, and one of them is hemp. If you're hearing about hemp all the time and you're a little bit confused, you are not alone. Hemp is a really old term that was used to describe cannabis that has been bred for long fibrous stalks to use more from a textile perspective and not for flowers that you smoke. And now hemp has a sort of workaround meaning. So it's being used a lot to talk about smokable cannabis bred for flowers that just happens to be super low in THC, which is the cannabinoid, the chemical compound that gets you stoned, and higher in other ones, namely CBD, marketed as the one that doesn't get you stoned. So if you're hearing all this stuff about hemp and hemp and hemp, people are not talking about weed bred for textiles. They are talking about weed bred for a chemical makeup that's other than THC. And I think the legal definition is like less than 0.3% THC by weight, it's considered hemp. But there are absolutely hemp farms with sticky resinous flowers meant for ingestion and consumption that aren't for textiles. So yeah, so let's talk about growing. There are, this is actually changing. So historically, there are two ways to start off. There's seed grown where you buy a seed and you start it, or there are clones where you're getting a vegetative cutting of a mature plant. So I am a huge fan of seeds, of starting from seed in general. I think seed starting is like nothing short of a miracle. It's much more simple. It scares people away, but I think everybody at least when I was going to preschool, we started pea seeds in styrofoam cups, right? Like it's not that hard. You stick a seed in some soil, you water it, it germinates, and it's magic. It's also actually a lot stronger of a plant. A seed, a plant that grows from a seed shoots out a super strong taproot right from the start, and it's a much stronger, much more resilient plant. I think people get scared that these little baby plants are so fragile and delicate, and that actually couldn't be further from the truth. They are juveniles, just like my young kiddo. Like he could fall from a high something and be fine the next day. And it's the same with weed. They, too much wind, subpar conditions, like they're fine, they're young, they don't care. Whereas a vegetative cutting, I think people think they're getting something a little bit more sturdy, but it indeed is actually more like me, the tired old mom that's ready to, lose it when things aren't just so. So people like clones because they are an exact genetic replica of the mother plant. So that it's a female, you don't have to go through this male female nonsense. You're getting a certain cultivar that you like, although there's really no accountability or central organizing factor with cannabis right now. So when you or I go to the store and we buy a packet of Sun Gold tomatoes, all of those tomatoes at this point, any tomato that you buy out of seed packet has been bred for stability, has been bred for uniformity. If I buy Sun Golds on this coast, they're going to be the same as the Sun Golds on that coast. They probably had some disease resistance bred into them or just even selected for. And that is really not the case with weed. So you have to be pretty particular about where you're getting your genetics, as they call it. So for that reason, like when you're getting a clone of OG Kush, let's say, like still whose OG Kush is it? What is OG Kush? We're still sort of defining these these things. They're all sort of more nebulous in the cannabis world. And that's the reason why I was sort of like against the wink, wink souvenir mail order, because there's just so much garbage, frankly, online, and not knowing where your seeds are coming from. So you want to look for a company that's, you know, pretty transparent about their breeding. It takes several generations of breeding to get a stable seed. I'm a big fan of the Humboldt Seed Company, up that are from Humboldt. And I wanted to say, oh, this is changing, because until recently, you couldn't get a seedling. You couldn't get the sort of sped up, like when you go to the nursery because you didn't start your seeds on time and you go grab a tomato. That is not a vegetative cutting. That's a seedling. Somebody started it at the right time for you. And until recently, that really hasn't been available, but more and more it's becoming available, especially in the hemp world. So in the non-high THC, there's a company called Grow It From Home, that there are more and more popping up where you can get mailed, because if you're not mailing a plant that contains THC in it, it can be shipped around the country. So you are able to get seedlings at this point, but they're just not going to be the ones that get you high. They're going to be CBD. And depending on what you're looking for, that might be great or not. So that was a little bit about starting. And then, okay, for learning to tell the sex. So I wanted to also say, so you can get feminized seeds, which are essentially plants that have been tricked into being hermaphroditic. And so the female becomes both, and you get seeds that are all feminized. They're all females. You get a crop of just female seeds. So you can buy feminized seeds. That's one way to forego the male female stuff. And then another way is you can get a genetic sex test. Phylos is just one company that does it. And if you Google, you know, cannabis sex test, a bunch of labs pop up. This is really fun. It's not the most price effective, but cost effective, but you get to feel like a scientist. You get to mash the cotyledon, which if you've ever started something from seed, and even if you haven't, when you first start something from seed, these two little round leaves emerge first that don't look like the plant you're growing. They're just these round little seed leaves. And those are called cotyledon. And you get to pick a little bit with tweezers and mash it into some special paper and mail it to the lab. And it's legal because there's no THC in the cotyledon. So you mail it and you get your results back online, and you see which of your plants are male and female. And you can just say sayonara right then and there to the males, or you can wait until they start to show their sex organs as they flower and do something called sex the plant, which I think is really fun because I've never had to sex a plant before. And again, that is another reason, almost enough for me to just grow weed, the fact that I get to sex my plants. So on the left, there was something else I wanted to tell you, but I all of a sudden can't remember. So I'm just going to keep going. So on the left, female plant, the delicate fine hairs. On the right, a male plant, balls. It's that simple. And there are ways to sort of tell before it starts to really flower in full. Oh, I know what I wanted to tell you. We'll get there. And then you put it in the ground, and it's flowering is not imminent. It's not like you see a male and then bam, you've pollinated everybody's crop, everybody's plants. You have a long time with that plant that it grows and develops until it ultimately does pop open with pollen. And if you do leave it outside, you will pollinate all of your flowers. I promise you, if anyone in your neighborhood is growing weed, you will likely pollinate all of theirs as well. You can absolutely try your hand at backyard breeding. You will probably suck at it. So it would be in your interest, and probably everyone around you's interest, to just get rid of the dudes. Weed, you can forget everything you've ever heard about growing weed. It is all written towards growing it indoors. So like I said, warm season, summer annual. That means full sun. All that means in my world is 6 to 8 hours minimum of full sun a day. That's it. Anything you've heard about cannabis and the like 12 hours this and 12 hours that and 8 and whatever, and that's all indoor speak for fluorescent, artificial, or LED, whatever, artificial lights. None of it applies outside. It's full sun. Wherever you plant your tomato, your squash, that's where it's going. And, you know, it's not a super thirsty plant. It actually will totally take whatever you give it, a lot of water, little water, it'll slurp it all up. It doesn't need a lot. I plant mine in, this was like the first year when I was doing bat guano and bone meal, which are sort of like classic cannabis amendments. I have gotten lazier and lazier, and I just do finished compost. Something I should tell you about my style of gardening is that I am lazy and I am tough love. And it's not, it's sort of by design. I think that plants actually grow a lot better when they are given the proper conditions from the start and then left alone. So if that's your type of gardening, I think you very much want to learn weed from me. And if you are looking to like change your life's course and maximize everything and sell to a dispensary and get the highest yield you can, I'm probably not your person. I'm growing it for like the love, the extreme love of the plant. There was something, oh, fertilizer. Yeah, there's all these like super complicated fertilizer schedules that people use when they're growing. Again, it's all nonsense. It's nonsense. And outdoors, it's a bunch of compost. So cannabis is mostly dioecious. Oh, sorry, I already said dioecious. It's mostly photoperiod dependent. So it grows and grows and grows. And then sometime after the summer solstice with the light waning, it flips from growing into flowering, and it flowers, and that's it. And again, in the indoor space, people talk about vegging and flowering and different amendments and all of this stuff. But I always liken it to a determinate tomato, which grows and grows and grows and then flowers and fruits. And I'm not obsessing over the moment when it starts flowering, and I'm not changing what I'm feeding it. And I'm not fixated on it. I think it gets that way because indoors you're flipping switches and you really are having to be more in control. And outdoors you're just not. You're letting the plant grow. Yeah, you can, I think this was in here to show you about growing in containers. No, okay. So in the book, I have a chapter on all different, that profiles a whole bunch of different growers, different people growing, and different reasons why and how they do it. And I think I included this slide just to show you that you can indeed grow in containers, no sweat, 5-gallon minimum, 15-gallon is ideal. And then I went to the Emerald Triangle in California, which is Humboldt, Mendocino, and Trinity counties, which is like ground zero for California's craft, smaller, outdoor family farming scene. And this is, for me, when the book stopped being just like hilarious, haha, high school Johanna, it all makes sense now. And a lot more serious of a project for me, because I met people like the farmer of these two beautiful pictures that you see, and Johnny Casali, and he is a second generation grower, taught how to grow by his mom, and he served 10 years in federal prison for his first ever run-in with the law when he was busted. And so I started wanting to take it more seriously, just in terms of this industry and how many people have sacrificed so much for it and are dependent upon it. This is perhaps my favorite story on the left from the book. It's a story about a man named Zero up in Marin, who is an old rock and roll guy who shared stages with like every musician you can think of from the 60s. He was an audio engineer and is like super cool, but like doesn't know anything about gardening. So he has learned to grow weed from a weed person. He's clearly doing a great job. That's a beautiful plant, massive cultivar. He takes it very seriously. But if you can tell, it's in a little kiddie pool, and he's scared of it touching the endemic native soil where he's growing. And that's ridiculous. Where he grows, his wife is like his wife is like from an Italian family, and she's a no-till gardener named Tilly, which is sort of funny. And there's like X number of persimmons, and really just beautiful. It's Eden, and Zero doesn't understand that it would be brilliant to have his plant being in the ground. So I think there's just a lot of misinformation in the cannabis scene where like you're scared of cannabis actually being a part of your garden, where and it is. It's no different. It's just a plant. And on the right is a regenerative farming family in Mendocino County, and they are completely off grid. They live a beautiful lifestyle with animals and their children, and grow a ton of herbal medicine, and cannabis is the one that pays their bills. And growing it is pretty easy. You might have also, it's very easy. It's called weed. You might have heard of very bizarre pruning practices. You don't need to learn any of them. Again, that's all from an indoor perspective, where you are needing to compensate for having static artificial light overhead. Whereas outdoors, we have the magical sun with its magical full spectrum of light that moves overhead throughout the day. If you do any pruning, it's just sort of topping the plant at the third or fifth, whatever node, to encourage more branching, and so that you get more a greater number of smaller flower clusters, which are called colas, rather than like a giant massive one, which sounds so cool, but is going to be a pain to dry and cure. I will say that one of my mentors comes over quite often to look at my plants and hang out. And last year, in the throes of the growing season, he was like, I gotta tell you, your plants are pruned like Sunset Magazine. Like, they look really good, but your yield could be higher. And I thought it was pretty funny, just because I do want the plant to be beautiful. I did want to address timing, because in the Bay Area, I'm assuming some of you are here, maybe you're not, it is getting a little late to start seeds. Cannabis largely tracks with tomatoes, so you'll have wanted to start them a while ago. So clones are a good bet as we get more and more into late spring, summer. And if you do get a clone, you want to be sure, this is some gardener speak right now, you want to be sure to harden it off really carefully, which means get it acclimated to the outdoors slowly and carefully. That plant has not seen a lick of daylight. It has not been grown under natural conditions. So you want to be really careful about bringing it in sunshine for a couple hours, then moving it back into the shade slowly and steadily. A really good option for starting seeds to get enough growth before it starts flowering is to go the auto flower route, which all cannabis is cannabis sativa. It doesn't matter like what you've heard about sativa and indica, they're all the same species. It's all cannabis sativa. The geneticists, the verdict is in from the geneticists. But there is a cousin called Cannabis ruderalis, which is like historically from Russia. It's terrible, weed that didn't get you high, from really cold conditions, really like garbage weed, but not photoperiod dependent. So it grows and it flowers. It doesn't matter where the sun is and what it's doing. It grows and it flowers. So people are getting more and more invested in breeding auto flowering into more desirable cultivars. Thus far, I have sort of like stayed away from auto flower, because I think getting into this, I've been such a purist and wanting to play. Like, I haven't wanted the feminized seeds. I haven't wanted the auto flower, but I am all in for auto flower. And I will tell you why. Wildfire season sucked. And there was ash raining on my plants for however long that was. And the idea of having my crop finish early is desirable. I'm into that. We can talk about wildfire stuff also later if you are interested. And then it starts to flower. And this is just absolutely why I'm in it. Like, no matter what you get at the dispensary, it kind of looks the same. It's a brown dried thing or a green dried thing. And when you get to grow something at home and witness the entire life cycle of a plant, you see a whole bunch of stuff that you've never seen before. And that really goes for any crop, and weed is no different. These little puffball flowers start to form in the armpits, and then things get really weird as flowering starts in earnest. The plant changes shape, it elongates, and the flowers get really smelly and really sticky and really alien-like, and it's awesome. And then you start to monitor for when it's done, when it's finished. And there is a classic way of doing it, which I don't use. So the classic way is to take a jeweler's loupe or some sort of magnification and go up close to these hairs, these stigmas that are growing out, and to see if the trichomes, the resinous glands that look like powdered sugar, are cloudy or clear. That's sort of like the standard way. But I have seen a lot of incredibly macro photography and video that reveals that these trichomes, cloudiness or clearness, are they change entirely based on your vantage point. So I don't really use that metric. I use two others. One of them is that when half the hairs, half or a little bit more than half, have died, have turned amber, and the other half are still white or pink or whatever color they were when they're growing, that's when I start to really pay attention for ripeness. And I also squeeze the bud. And if it's still incredibly spongy and bounces right back, not done yet. And then it firms up. And when it's firm, it's done. And it's again a thing that, like, if you were growing this to sell to a dispensary and it had to be just so, that's one thing. But this is it's not rocket science, and it doesn't really even have to be science. It's akin to when your tomato is ripe out there and you're like, do I want to let it go one more day or 2 more days or not? You're not going to ruin your entire crop. The profile of cannabinoids and terpenes might change a bit, but you're still going to grow weed and it's still going to be pretty good. And I think this slide is in here just to show you proof that I grew some pretty fine looking weed that very first year. And then it's harvest time. And you're going to cut down your plant either all at once, branch by branch. If you can, it's really ideal to make these little hooks, the ready-made hooks, because as you'll see, you're going to dry and cure your plant. So this is how I wanted to dry my book. Oh, if you haven't noticed, the pictures are gorgeous, right? So I worked with Rachel Weil, a brilliant, brilliant lifestyle photographer who I'd worked with for years at Sunset Magazine, and we did this book together. And it's so pretty. We wanted to treat weed like it should be treated, elevated, gorgeous. And I wanted my drying room to be just as beautiful. So this is a closet in my home that I cleared out and hung twine, and it's going to be so pretty for the book. It's the pictures in the book, but with the story that my husband politely request that he could stop going to work smelling like he'd ripped a bong every morning. So part of the book that looks like everybody else's weed book is my actual drying room, which is in the unfinished laundry space. And if you've ever grown an herb, if you've ever dried an herb, it's really similar. You need somewhere cool, somewhere dark, somewhere not too humid, not bone dry. So I give specific ranges in the book, and you can get a small hygrometer. That's this little magnetic thing, and it will show you where you're at, and you can tweak it from there. I use a small oscillating fan that I've had since college that goes back and forth on the ground just to keep some airflow going. I haven't gotten out a humidifier or dehumidifier, but that might be something you do to keep it in the desired range. There are ways the goal with drying any herb, or in specific with cannabis, is that you keep the terpenes, which is fancy speak for essential oils, for how it smells, and the cannabinoids. You want to dry it slowly so that those don't evaporate into air. At the same time, you want to dry it fast enough so that problems with mold and mildew don't wreak havoc. And so the goal is like a 10 to 14 day slow, steady dry. So you sort of tweak your conditions to get there. And if you are in a really humid place, you might do all your trimming, which is sort of taking off this excess plant material that doesn't have many of those trichomes on it. You might take that off first, so that as it dries, it doesn't have all that excess plant material, which slows things down. Similarly, if you're somewhere bone dry, you're going to leave all this plant material on because it's going to make things go slower. And you can mess around. Trimming is like a whole big thing in the cannabis world. You know, it's like so labor intensive, and there's an entire industry built around people who go up to trim weed. And it's really not that big of a deal when you're growing at home and you just have a few plants. And there's all different ways you can do it. But at the end of the day, guess what? I store my weed untrimmed. So this is how you might buy it at the dispensary. And this is how I store mine, and how everyone who sells to the dispensary, who's like pro level grower, actually stores their own stash for multiple reasons. So in this, you can see that I've left on some of those, some fan leaves and some sugar leaves. I've just left more of that leaf material there. I've taken it off its stem and bucked it into different storage containers. And first of all, it's a heck of a lot less laborious. I'm not spending, hours getting sticky with weed, but it also, all those leaves act as a cocoon for that beautiful flower. So when it's time to, let's say use some, you can whip out a bud, trim it up. It looks beautiful, pristine. You're everybody's hero. And you're gonna get a lot of weed. If you're like me, you're gonna get more weed than you know what to do with. So you give it away to everyone you've ever met, and you still have more weed. And you wanna store it properly, which is in something airtight, and it can be glass. I love these stainless steel locking containers. And it's dry when like the bud sort of sounds like popcorn, like that a little like crinkle in your ear, and most of the branches snap. And then you go into curing. So I don't make a big fuss between the two. I get them into their containers, and to cure is like that final step of drawing whatever moisture is deep in the bud out so that it's evenly dry. And so the way I do it is I burp the jars. I seal them up at night. I go to where they are in the morning. I open them up. I will find that for the first few days or a week, they're wetter in the morning. It's like, that's not quite how I left it. And so I will leave the lid off for an hour or a day, depending on how wet they are, and do the same thing. And pop the lid back on at night, come back. And you can get these small hygrometers too. I'm seeing if I have one nearby that you can put directly in the container if you're really curious to like make sure it's like optimal, whatever, everything. And then you can get a Bovida. These are a two-way humidity pack that maintain the moisture, the humidity exactly where it's at. I will tell you, I am really inexact with all of this too. I am resting on like mostly high school Johanna's like memory of what dank weed felt like. And so it's like when it feels like weed that's going to crumble into a joint or whatever, I call it done. I thoroughly messed up this year. I had it in a container that I thought was sealed, that like locked, and it wasn't. And I was just so lazy. Every day I'd walk by and I would like smell all the terpene. I like knew everything was evaporating, and I was just too lazy to deal with it. So even that, what month is it? It's like April, and I've had this weed since like October. I let friends and pros dip into it, right? Because I wrote a book on weed. They want to see my weed. It is still awesome weed. I am still getting compliments on it. It smokes with a white ash, which means I didn't over fertilize it, and it was properly dried and cured. So again, there's like some buffer room. You don't have to ace everything. And I think that a lot of the cultivation attitude has been so perfectionist, again, because part of it because this was your only shot. It's not, it wasn't as widely available, but partly because you're growing, to sell, and it has to be some level of perfect that it just frankly doesn't have to be for your own use. And then in the book, I talk all about different ways to use your harvest, how to make a tincture out of it, how to infuse oil, how to make salve. There are various fun recipes in it. And okay, yeah. And this is a pretty picture of it growing in a friend's garden. I did want to say that I am finally coming to terms with the fact that I'm very hell bent on it being just like any other garden crop. And I'm, as I mentioned, like lazy and tough love for all of them. And now, maybe 4 seasons in, I'm ready to admit the one way that it's not like every other garden crop, and at least in the Bay Area, that is with is bud rot. And that is when all the caterpillars, all the butterflies, moths lay their eggs into the flowers, and then the caterpillars hatch and they poop, and the poop rots, and you get something called bud rot, which when you're harvesting shows up as gray and soft, and you want to cut that out and not include it in what you're drying and curing because it'll just spread. And same with powdery mildew. I don't care when my zucchini and my cucumbers get powdery mildew, because they'll still crank out a crop for me. But when you're getting powdery mildew, which is a fungus inside of your flowers, smoking a fungus is less desirable. I think we can all agree. So there are some like pest issues that I'm finally ready to admit that makes cannabis a little bit different than everything else in the garden. And you have sort of options. The main way to control for bud rot is to spray with Bacillus thuringiensis, which is BT. It's a once a week from when flowering starts until flowering basically ends. It is an organic biological pesticide. So it's a bacteria that's found in soil that you're applying to the flowers. It's been around since the 70s, totally safe for humans, messes with other butterfly populations like monarchs. So I'm still not getting down with the BT. And I think I am indeed making peace with the fact that as an organic gardener, I already embrace that I'm losing some of my crop. Organic farmers already overplant because they recognize that they are choosing to be more in a dance with nature rather than trying to control it. So even though I am finally admitting that I'm going to be losing more of my crop than I want to bud rot, I think I'm still not spraying. So last year I lost an embarrassing amount. I lost maybe a third of my harvest to bud rot, and I was ashamed of myself. But as I've talked it out with you all right here, actually I've been talking with friends, I really am making peace, because I don't want to mess with monarch populations. I don't want to mess with other creatures. Okay, this was like my confessional. I keep growing despite not being a massive user. I keep growing because I find the plant endlessly fascinating. And there are all sorts of cool cultivars. This one is called Freak Show, and it has a mutant leaf that's been selected for because it's crazy looking. I hated the smell of this one last year, and I'm very like yes or no when it comes to a smell. And it reminds me of the wine editor that I worked with for my 10 years at Sunset. And, me telling her I don't have a refined palate. And she's like, you don't need one. You take a sip of wine and it's a yes or a no. And it's the same with a smell of cannabis. It's like, yes, I might enjoy you, or no, like don't get anywhere near me. And for me, Freak Show, I heard it described as like eucalyptus with touches of something and something. And to me, it was just like dirty mop water. Don't want anything to do with it. And the other thing that keeps me interested and interested in the plant and being around the plant and around people who grow it has been my ability to connect back to to roots of mine as a person. Before I even was into gardening, I was into social justice, and then life took me on a strange creative turn. But in the wake of, I feel like this is a great day since the verdict came in today, in the wake of George Floyd's death, and in my own self-reflection of a lack of diversity in my book and in my 10 years at Sunset, and in the breadth of stories that I tell, I went out, I endeavored on a project last year to find Black cannabis gardeners, outdoor garden scale, and tell their stories. And, they are gardens that I might have passed by had they fallen in my desk the first time, because, they don't look as, they're not as like pretty and ready to shoot, which I'm just looking for the prettiest and the best. And that's how you get a bunch of white people's gardens. So I found some other gardens that, with a little bit of this, moving things around, created some absolutely beautiful photographs and was able to tell stories that I had never told before, and learned a lot. And I think it's incredibly important as we talk about a legal industry, and we have 44,000 people still behind bars for this plant. And we have 96 or 7% of businesses in the cannabis space still owned by white men. So I think it's a very important discussion to have around equity and representation in the industry. And I'm so pleased to tell you that this story that was just a labor of love, I didn't know where it was going. I didn't know if it was for my own Instagram. I didn't know what it was just on the front page of the special cannabis section of the San Francisco Chronicle yesterday. What is today? 2 days ago, Sunday. These 4 gardener stories are told and talking about the industry in general. And that is it. That's my last slide. So now I stop and I'm ready to take questions. I can open the chat so I can see them. Nick, I'm done. So if there are questions, please post them. Are you here? Is anyone here?
I'm here. Hello. Sorry.
Hi. No, it's fine. That's all I really have to say. I mean, that's the book. There's a lot more info. I hope people will buy it, and you can reach me via my website, johannasilver.com. Oh, there is a question. Sorry, there was one question. Robin Roth, what do you think about grow bags so roots can access more air? Yes, great question, Robin. Thank you. So grow bags, you might have seen, are these felt bags that people like cannabis farmers often use, and they're lightweight, and they Robin, I'm going to shoot straight with you. I don't really care about the access to more air. People who use felt like get all weirdly obsessed with it, and I think that really why people are using them is that they are lightweight and store easily and cheap. But cannabis grows in any container. It doesn't need special oxygenated access for its roots. I grow it in ceramic, terracotta, food safe plastic, anything. So if it's a route you want to go because it's light and it's cheap, do it. But if you've got something else on hand to grow your weed in, perfectly fine. And if anyone else, I mean, please don't be shy. Please don't be shy. Ask a question.
If I could.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you went about finding more people to photograph for your book, to diversify all the people that showed up in it. Where you went, how you went about finding them, if it was your publicist did a good job, or if you made a Facebook post.
It was no publicist was involved in the diversity project. I didn't know where to start. I think it occurred to me, the idea occurred to me, but I was insecure about it, as we all can be and can feel when we begin, trying to have a little bit of a reckoning with maybe what we've done up until then. And so it was actually a few different ways. I spoke to a friend of mine, Leslie Bennett, who is a Black garden designer in the Bay Area of Pine House Edible Gardens. You should look her up. She has Black sanctuary gardens, building Black gardens for Black people to have sanctuaries in. And she put me in touch with a few Black people she knew. So it was starting to find people that way. A girlfriend that I grew up with in Denver, Colorado, lives in Portland, Oregon, and married a Black man who grows weed. And he's one of the people I profiled up in Portland. And I cold called a incredible woman. The woman featured is Dejanay Evans. And I cold called her after finding her as a cannabis influencer in LA, and she's magical. And then my buddy Jamal is featured as one of them. And I guess, to give myself a little credit, I tried to include him in the original book, but he is so shy. And in the Chronicle piece, he also goes by his first name only. He's still sketched out by all of this. So it was convincing him to let me photograph him, and finding people. I was still picky. I didn't want farmers, and I didn't want indoor growers. I wanted people who I related to as a gardener. So it's just, I don't think I went as far as making a post, but it was just flipping through the Rolodex, not being shy.
Maybe one last question. Jay Burdahl says, I missed the first part of your presentation, but do you know, or could you talk about the hardiness zones for successful growing?
Yes, you did miss it. And what you missed was that it is a warm season annual. So it's one and done. It's one growing season, and it doesn't matter your growing season. It doesn't matter if you're, somewhere freezing with a super short or a long one. It's not hardy to a deep I don't even it's done. It's a tomato. It's like you want to choose a cultivar that will finish by the time your winter is coming.
Excellent. Well, okay. Thanks for coming out tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. To everybody who has been watching the entire time, and to everybody else who managed to make it in, wherever you made it in through this conversation, we're glad that you came out tonight. Make sure you buy the book at bookpassage.com. It's linked. There's a big blue bar at the top of the YouTube chat where you can go and find her book. If you enjoyed that or any of the other photographers or other books that she talked about here tonight, you can find them at bookpassage.com. If you live in the Bay Area, you can order it from us and pick it up at the store. And if you don't live in the Bay Area, we'll ship it right to your house. Yeah, thanks for coming out one last time. We'll be sure to see you in the next one. Thanks again.